when appointments are perceived as politically influenced
Yes.
or procedurally compromised, then it's common sense that leadership legitimacy is definitely weakened because there's a strong correlation between leadership legitimacy
Mm.
and trust. It's
Correct.
based on trust. And when these appointment processes are perceived as, let's say, factional or
Mm.
politically influenced,
Mm.
then these newly appointed leaders may struggle to unify staff members. And research on leadership legitimacy tells us
Mm.
that fairness perceptions strongly influence the buy-in and cooperation of their staff members.
Yes.
And this is not derived solely from positional authority, but it's
Mm.
built on trust and it's
Mm.
built on perceived fairness and it's also built on professional credibility. So if stakeholders believe that the process is actually lacking transparency,
Mm.
then that appointed leader begins their tenure at already a relational disadvantage.
Mm.
South Africa's post-apartheid governance framework is rooted in democratic participation and social justice.
Yeah.
And school governing bodies were actually introduced to democratize schooling and to also give communities a voice. And the teacher unions also play a legitimate role in protecting labor rights.
Mm.
But when these pillars sort of intersect in the lived space of school, then more often than not, tensions emerge. And this is particularly around educator appointments and discipline authority.
Mm.
And those tensions directly affect school culture. It also
Yes.
affects leadership legitimacy and ultimately the teaching and learning environment that our students may enter. So over time, I found that my work has become less about isolated issues
Mm.
and more about these ecosystems. Yes, definitely, because these appointment processes actually have ripple effects.
Mm.
And when these processes are transparent or when they're participatory and procedurally sound, then they reinforce this trust and they also strengthen a collaborative culture that we want to see in
Yes.
schools.
Mm.
So staff are more likely to align with these leadership decisions.
Mm.
Conversely, it's important to note that these contested or maybe opaque processes can
Mm.
also further entrench factionalism.
Mm.
And staff may sometimes even align along unions
Mm.
or governance lines. And this fragmentation that we see can often undermine this collective discipline efforts made by whomever.
Mm.
And we also see that school culture is also deeply shaped by perceptions of fairness.
If you value cutting edge research and want to hear more academics share their work, subscribe to the Solomon Atah Podcast, hit a like, leave a comment, and help us grow this community. Your support makes it possible for more PhD scholars to share their insights with you. Across South Africa, debates about school discipline, leadership, and governance continue to shape the future of education. In this episode, we explore what really happens at the intersection of teacher education, policy implementation, and social justice, moving beyond headlines to examine the structural dynamics inside schools. This conversation asks a question. When discipline and leadership falter, where does the breakdown truly begins? My guest is Dr. Amy Padayachee, a scholar whose work engages teacher education, school governance, and the politics of policy implementation in South Africa. Her research examines how discipline, educator appointments, and institutional power intersects to shape school culture and leadership legitimacy. Drawing from sustained engagement with schools and governance structures, she offers nuanced insight into the tensions between unions, school governing bodies, and the broader pursuit of equity and accountability. The Solomon Atah Podcast with Dr. Amy Padayachee starts now. Good afternoon, Amy, and welcome to the podcast.
Good afternoon, Solomon, and thank you for having me.
Fantastic. I am in Lagos, Nigeria. Where are you speaking to us from?
From Cape Town today.
Oh, fantastic. I hear that Cape Town is a city where The cloud covers the mountain and then the sun covers the rest. Is that the case?
Today, definitely that is, yes.
Oh, fantastic. Awesome stuff. So, Amy, what is the overarching area of your research? Perhaps you want to walk our audience through so that before we get into the questions, they have a clue exactly what your research is on.
My research focus is on education, management, leadership, and policy.
Mm,
I had served as a teacher in basic education for 15 years.
great.
And I have since joined the higher education sector, serving as a lecturer
Mm,
to pre-service teachers.
oh,
So my
fantastic.
research focuses not only on these pre-service teachers and their experiences
Mm,
outside of the lecture hall, but
mm,
also on how policy and legislation and all matters pertaining to leadership and management rather
mm,
impacts on our students
mm.
that go into these classrooms in the South African context.
Fantastic. So you have experience from basic education and now in higher education. That is a lot of experience in actual practice. How has that been like?
I think it's also allowed me to sort of see how it unfolds, how education unfolds,
Mm,
stemming from being in a classroom and in basic education,
yeah.
teaching, the fundamentals and the basics of
Mm,
just subject specifics, and
mm,
now leading to a setting where we are teaching pre-service teachers how to best manage their classrooms and
mm,
sort of get practice in a real context of
mm,
education. It's nice to see the transition from basic education to higher education, and also to assist them in, addressing real life problems that we've sort of seen in basic education. So it's more like practice actually unfolding in the higher education sector.
can imagine that. Fantastic. Your work sits at that intersection of teacher education, governance, and social justice in South Africa. What initially drew you to this space, and how has your research journey evolved over time?
So my research didn't begin in abstraction, but it actually began as an encounter. As I said, I was a
Mm,
teacher in basic education for a long time. And now, as a lecturer, working closely with pre-service teachers during this work integrated learning
mm,
experience,
mm,
I noticed that many of the challenges that they reported were not simply about the teaching strategies or classroom techniques that they
mm.
face on a daily basis,
Yeah.
but they were sort of navigating schools where leadership authority was often questioned and contested. And in a lot of circumstances, I also found that disciplinary systems were inconsistent.
Mm.
And coupled with that was appointment processes that were very politically charged. And also,
See.
we found that governance structures were strained. So I think it was in that moment that it became very clear to me that teacher education actually can't be separated from governance realities.
Okay.
And what we do is we prepare teachers for the classroom, but those classrooms are also very deeply embedded within governance structures and
Mm,
systems. And these discipline practices that they experience in the classroom are
mm,
often shaped by leadership, because leadership is often sort of shaped by the appointment processes that govern them. And on the back end of that, we must also remember that the appointment processes are shaped by school governing bodies and by teacher trade unions and
mm,
by policy frameworks that direct it. And what's important to note is that all of this still unfolds within a deeply unequal society. So I think for me, my research evolved organically into
mhm,
examining how these layers intersect. And I became particularly interested in how policy is
mm.
enacted in practice. And just to put that into perspective,
Yeah.
South Africa's, sorry, do you want to continue?
No, no, no. I'm saying, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Mm,
South Africa's post-apartheid governance framework
mm,
is rooted in democratic participation and social justice.
yeah.
And school governing bodies were actually introduced to democratize schooling and to also give communities a voice. And the teacher unions also play a legitimate role in protecting labor rights.
Mm,
But when these pillars sort of intersect in the live space of school, then more often than not, tensions emerge. And this is particularly around educator appointments and discipline authority.
Mm.
And those tensions directly affect school culture. It
I
also
see.
affects leadership legitimacy and ultimately the teaching and learning environment that our students may enter. So over time, I found that my work has become less about isolated issues
Mm.
and more about these ecosystems. And I have started to see learner discipline as not merely that, but it's also a reflection of governance coherence. Similarly, leadership is not just positional authority, but it's also legitimacy constructed through these somewhat fair processes. And the teacher training that we offer our students is not merely skills training, but it's also preparation for navigating these very structurally
Mm.
complex institutions.
Mm.
So for me, social justice sits at the center of this. And
Right.
I feel that when governance processes are transparent and procedurally fair, then they build trust. But at the same time, when they are opaque or politicized,
Mm.
then they entrench inequality and they also weaken this institutional stability that we find in South African classrooms. So I think my research journey has evolved into asking a central integrative question,
Mm.
and that is how can democratic governance,
Mm.
together with labor representation and leadership practice,
Mm.
and teacher preparation, align in ways that help us to sustain this fair, collaborative, and disciplined school culture in South Africa. And I think that this is a space where these pillars do converge.
Absolutely. I'm listening to you, and I can just imagine how the contestation could be in terms of legitimacy. But at the
Mm.
end of the day, in terms of learning and teaching experience, whose direct outcome are the students or the learners? So, what did you find there as what is starting to emerge there, Amy?
I think you are completely correct in that the learner is the one that unfortunately has to bear the brunt of this. And oftentimes, I don't think that's even considered when we talk about teacher appointments, because we often forget that behind the procedure is
Mm.
a learner. And the impact of that child's education is something that we should focus a lot more on, because I think that tends to be overseen in a lot of circumstances.
Much of your research interrogates the relationship between school discipline and policy implementation. And this policy implementation could be various, could be either from the
Mhm.
labor union side or from the leadership structures in school. In your view, where does this real breakdown actually occur?
I think that the breakdown really occurs at the level of policy design, because to
Okay.
be honest, South Africa has a very strong constitutional and legislative framework.
Mm.
However, I find that the challenge actually lies in policy enactment, how these role players perceive policy. And there's often this ambiguity in these role boundaries.
Mm.
There's also very limited leadership capacity, and there's this inconsistent procedural adherence. And also coupled with that is insufficient training of these role players that we speak of.
Mm.
There's also large role ambiguity because school management teams and school governing bodies and district officials always don't share common understanding of these procedural boundaries. So I think coupled with that is a capacity gap that also exists because many schools do lack the sustained training
Mm.
of these procedures that they speak of in policy. So for me, I think the breakdown is not legal, it's
Mm.
more organizational and relational, and it
Mm.
also lies in how this policy is interpreted, how sometimes it may be negotiated and also implemented
Mm.
within these complex school environments.
Mm.
So ultimately, discipline fails not because of this weak legislation that some people perceive it to be, but
Mm.
actually because governance ecosystems are unevenly capacitated.
Is there no interest in terms of, just as I'm listening to you, in terms of these stakeholders, these players in the ecosystem demonstrating a willingness for collaborative environment in order to achieve better outcomes for the beneficiary of that space, the learner?
Well, that is what my research aims to do, to draw awareness to
Yeah.
collaboration and how that can benefit not just the child in the classroom,
Mm,
but all stakeholders. And I'm hoping that by the end of this, role players would be able to see that there is an urgent need for collaboration.
absolutely. Amy, let's move a little bit, two more steps forward. Much of your research, much of your research and engagement with schools, no, from your research and engagement with school, how would you describe the current state of discipline in South African schools? Are we facing a crisis, or is the issue more nuanced than the public narrative suggests?
I think that it is uneven and to a large extent, maybe context bound.
Okay.
Because in some schools, and I think this leads to what we were just talking about,
Mm,
in some schools, particularly those with strong collaborative leadership, discipline systems are actually very preventative and in some cases even restorative and
mm,
structured. But in other contexts, and particularly those affected by those
mm.
socioeconomic stresses and
Yes.
discipline challenges,
Mm,
um, I think discipline and indiscipline becomes more acute
mm,
because there are issues of broader societal violence, unemployment, and also inequality, which inevitably, sorry, will always
mm,
filter into schools.
mm.
However, I think it would be inaccurate to frame this as a universal collapse, but rather we should look at it as I would like to use the term differentiated capacity.
Mm,
Because if we look at research on school violence and discipline issues,
mm.
there's a strong correlation between school climate,
Yeah.
leadership coherence, and
Mm,
also learner behavior. So to me, the issue is not systemic, but it's rather, I think, contextual.
mm,
So discipline reflects the health of leadership,
mm.
governance coherence, and also school culture. So let's not look at it as being universally catastrophic,
Yeah.
but looking at it contextually rather.
Mm. Amy, why don't you just look into when you say something like school discipline?
Mhm.
Is it school discipline amongst stakeholders, or is it school discipline? Is it a top-down school discipline that you are referring to in terms of how discipline is meted out to students or learners? What do you mean school discipline and issues around that?
Yes, thank you for that question. When I refer to school discipline, I'm talking about the impact of this leadership on
Mm.
learner culture, learner
All right.
behavior.
Mm.
And there is a strong correlation between the two because you often see that when leadership is not well structured in the school, it
Yeah.
is impossible to cultivate an atmosphere of, you know, poor or rather proper discipline.
Yeah.
Leadership and discipline are directly related to each other, and they can't function in isolation.
Great stuff. You have also explored the role of teacher unions and school governing bodies in educator appointments. What are some of the key tensions or complexities you've uncovered in the South African schooling context?
So for me, one of the most significant complexities,
Mm,
and what stands out for me,
mm,
lies in what I would call democratic convergence.
okay.
And let me just put that into perspective. Post 1994, South Africa deliberately designed a governance system that balances community voice and labor rights. And the South African Schools Act institutionalized school governing bodies as
Mm,
vehicles of this participative democracy.
mm,
And on the other hand, teacher unions operate within constitutionally protected labor frameworks,
mm.
and both are legitimate actors within a democratic society.
Great.
But the tensions arise not from, I would say, illegitimacy, but
Mm,
from this overlapping influence.
mm,
So, in educator appointments, school governing bodies are actually mandated to recommend candidates who gets the post. And unions are only there for the process of observing the process to ensure
mm,
fairness
mm,
and to ensure that the members' rights are being protected.
mm.
But these provincial departments retain the final appointment authority. So this creates a multi-layered government structure where authority is shared and it's negotiated, and sometimes it's even contested.
Mm,
So in practice, there are quite a few tensions that have emerged.
mm.
And the first is merit versus, I would say, representativity.
Yeah.
And what our study has found is that appointment processes must balance professional competence
Yes.
with these transformation imperatives,
Mm,
because South Africa's historical inequalities necessitates this representativity. However, schools often seek candidates who fit an institutional culture or the leadership needs. But when these priorities are perceived to conflict, then tensions definitely intensify. Uh, what my study also found was role ambiguity, because
mm,
although policy outlines very distinct responsibilities,
mm.
in reality, the boundaries are not always clearly enacted.
I see.
And I mustn't always forget to mention the local power dynamics,
Mm,
because appointments don't occur in neutral spaces.
mm.
They occur within communities, and these communities come with histories and alliances and political affiliations. So in some contexts,
Mm,
these
very
appointments
intricate.
become, it is.
Yeah.
In some contexts,
Mm,
these educator appointments become extensions of broader socio-political struggles, which
yes.
we often don't realize. And the politicization shifts the focus from institutional needs to actually relational or maybe ideological alignment.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, Amy, from your work, I mean, in broad strokes, in terms of collaborative engagement and research work done across the country or across the continent or across global South, what is emerging as potential outcomes or solutions towards this sort of contestation or this sort of scenarios in terms of school, in terms of what your research is about?
I must be very honest with you. It's actually been a struggle to
Okay.
sort of find the gap between that, because there has been so much of research that has been done on the issues pertaining to educator appointments and promotions in South
Mm,
African schools, but very little has been done. And again, I'm going to say policy is there. There's a
mm,
framework to guide and determine these
mm,
processes and procedures, but it's the lack of training and the incapacity of people who are put in these positions that
mm,
creates the problems for it. So my hope is that through this study, we would be able to bridge the gap
mm,
between what policy is speaking to and what is actually happening in reality. But we are
mm,
far, far away from doing that, in all honesty.
mm. Tough job, tough research area you are on,
Definitely.
Amy. What are the implications of the politicized appointments processes for leadership legitimacy within schools?
So when appointments are perceived as politically influenced
Yes.
or procedurally compromised, then it's common sense that leadership legitimacy is definitely weakened, because there's a strong correlation between leadership legitimacy
Mm,
and trust. It's
correct.
based on trust. And when these appointment processes are perceived as, let's say, factional or
Mm,
politically influenced,
mm,
then these newly appointed leaders may struggle to unify staff members. And research on leadership legitimacy tells us
mm,
that fairness perceptions strongly influence the buy-in and cooperation of their staff members.
yes.
And this is not derived solely from positional authority, but it's
Mm,
built on trust, and it's
mm,
built on perceived fairness, and it's also built on professional credibility. So if stakeholders believe that the process is actually lacking transparency,
mm,
then that appointed leader begins their tenure at already a relational disadvantage, unfortunately. So over time, this can definitely affect discipline, and it can
mm.
also affect organizational coherence.
Yes.
And staff buy-in and commitment then becomes a problem.
Amy, I want you to just take a step back.
Mhm.
Look at the difficulty, if any, of pre-service teachers
Yes.
and the learners. I want you to put them into this intersection and see how is social justice achieved and benefits for both, because a pre-service teacher, I would suspect that they are very new in the field, and the politics of the field could be could be an impediment of some sort in terms of how they deliver on their mandate of teaching learners, and how the learner too is caught up in all of this, and what possible outcomes could this be. Then I will ask you a follow-up question about where is this predominant?
I think for pre-service teachers, even before they leave the institution, whilst they are seeking employment, this
Yes.
is very apparent to them. Um, if you look at how many of our teachers actually get employed, the statistics are actually shocking. And sometimes it's not because there is a scarcity of job availability, but it's because of these highly politicized jobs and promotions. And as a result of that, it holds back the procedures. And over time, you'll see that there's a backlog in appointing educators, which directly impacts on our pre-service teachers not being able to find placement in schools. And as a result of that, learners in the classroom are left for long periods of time, sometimes without a teacher being there to present a lesson
The
to them,
material, yes.
as a result of teachers not being put in these positions in good time because of the processes that are now delayed as a result of these highly politicized um, positions.
So far, where is this mostly predominant? Where have you seen from your research work, Amy, that is this mostly in urban schools? Is it mostly in rural schools, under-resourced schools, or where is this ground overly contested?
I think it is most peculiar to government schools because with private schools, remember, they have a board of directors and the appointment procedures are slightly different from that of public schools.
Yeah.
With public schools, educators will have to wait for positions to be applied in an HRM and from there send through their CVs and wait for the process to unfold. So it's not specific to particular areas in South African schools. Yes, under-resourced schools, of course, come with their own difficulties. But I think across South Africa, regardless of which area a school is situated in, we see that there are issues pertaining to this across the board.
Have you found evidence that appointment processes influence broader school culture, including staff morale, collaboration, and discipline?
Yes, definitely, because these appointment processes actually have ripple effects. And when these processes are transparent or when they're participatory and procedurally sound, then they reinforce this trust and they also strengthen a collaborative culture that we want to see in
Yes.
schools. So staff are more likely to align with these leadership decisions. Conversely, it's important to note that these contested or maybe opaque processes can also further entrench factionalism. And staff may sometimes even align along unions or governance lines. And this fragmentation that we see can often undermine this collective discipline efforts made by whomever. And we also see that school culture is also deeply shaped by perceptions of fairness. And these governance processes, we must remember, are not just administrative technicalities, but to a large extent, they become culture forming mechanisms that exist in schools. So ultimately, I would say that educator appointments and these disciplinary systems are very closely intertwined through this leadership legitimacy that we speak of and organizational trust as a whole.
Amy, as we're starting to wrap up our really very insightful conversation, what has your research been able to recommend, and to what extent has it really influenced policy or understanding, perhaps, let me say, on this general understanding around these kinds of areas that you've unearthed in your research?
So I am still in the phase of moving through the provinces. Thus
Mm.
far, we've done 4 provinces, and the results were pretty much the same when it came to the contestation in
Yeah.
educator appointments and promotions.
Mm.
Similarly, the data also speaks to how that impacts on not just discipline, but also the
Mm.
culture of teaching and learning that exists in
Mm.
schools. So I'm hoping that by the end of the study, what it can aim to do in the
Mm.
future is inform policy of these gaps, the
Yes.
gap between a policy enactment and actual training of
Mm.
people that are responsible for putting these people into positions of authority.
Yeah.
So hopefully by the end of the study, I will have more answers for you. But for now, that's what
Certainly, we
it
will be
seems to
here.
do.
We will be
Yes.
here to get more of to get that
Yes.
because we want to accompany researchers on their journeys in as they
Yes.
uncover new knowledge in their area of study. Uh,
Yes.
Amy, final thoughts, and in these final thoughts, won't you please kind of mention some of the highlights that you've also achieved? Because I know that in every work we do, there's things that we
Mhm.
get done and there's things that we are still in the process of getting done. And also some people that may have inspired your work and continue to inspire you as a scholar, practitioner, of course.
Yes, definitely. So, achievements thus far, I've presented this study to the National Research Foundation,
Mm.
and I've actually won an award for it.
Oh,
Maybe
congratulations.
because it's such a highly debatable topic and many
Mm.
people can relate to it. Whether you've
Mm.
been a teacher or not, it's very relatable because we know
Mm.
that when it comes to jobs, there's a lot of contestation around it.
Mm.
So that has been a highlight. I've also had the opportunity of being funded by the National Research Foundation to
Mm.
continue with this study.
Mm.
And as a result of that, it has allowed me to present this work on national and international platforms. I've
Yes.
presented in Bulgaria, in
Mm.
Greece, and I've had the opportunity to also engage with others who are responsible for policy design and implementation from other countries, which
Mm.
also can help us to inform our policy in South
Yes.
Africa. Who I am greatly influenced by,
Mm.
maybe Professor Jonathan Johnson.
Mm.
I
Yeah, his
quite
name
like how
comes up quite a
frank he,
bit from academics I've
yeah,
spoken to. That's very, he was the former rector at the University of the Free State, is that so?
that is very
Yes.
correct.
Mm.
Yes. So I find that a lot of my work resonates with his in terms of leadership and
Mm.
policy.
Mm.
And I've had the opportunity of meeting him a few times,
Oh,
and he's also
great.
spoken to this study and how I can
Mm.
maybe also include other stakeholders to
Mm.
inform what I've
Mm.
already done thus far.
Mm. Fantastic. Dr. Amy Padayachee, it's been great chatting to you. I look forward to engaging you subsequently on more research. And thank you for
Sure.
being on the podcast.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.